Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're tackling a really tough but important subject, the reality inside South Africa's prisons.
Yeah.
We've got some quite compelling sources here, reports, articles, even firsthand accounts.
Mm-hmm.
And our mission really is to get past the usual ideas about prisons and uh, extract what's fundamentally going on based on this material.
Exactly. Because often, we think prisons, we think violence, maybe mystery.
Right.
But what these sources show is, well, it's a much more complex picture. Systemic challenges, really, that need a closer look. We want to unpack what's actually happening and why it matters.
And the first thing that just leaps out from almost all material is this crisis of overcrowding.
Oh, absolutely.
The 2023 Judicial Inspectorate Report. It is many prisons are running at like 150, even 200% capacity.
It's mind-boggling.
Over 157,000 people crammed into spaces just not designed for those numbers.
And what's fascinating and pretty concerning is how this overcrowding isn't just one problem. It sort of triggers a whole cascade of others.
How so?
Well, it's not just about being cramped, right? It directly impacts access to the absolute basics. If you've got double the people a place was built for, how do you possibly guarantee enough food, clean water, decent health care? It becomes almost impossible.
Yeah, and the sources really paint a stark picture of those conditions. Dire, really. We're hearing about places like Pollsmoor, Johannesburg prison, where it's so bad, inmates are actually sleeping in shifts.
Sleeping in shifts. Just imagine that. The lack of basic rest, the constant disruption. Yeah.
So you have this extreme overcrowding, resources stretched incredibly thin. It sounds like a breeding ground for tension.
And that leads directly into the next major issue the sources highlight.
Yeah.
Pervasive violence. That's not really surprising, given the conditions.
No, that makes sense, sadly. What are the numbers like?
Well, the Department of Correctional Services back in 2022 reported over 1,200 assaults and several murders inside the facilities in just 1 year.
That's a lot. And the gangs. The material mentions them prominently.
Yes, the numbers gangs, the 26s, 27s, 28s, they're central figures in this.
Yeah.
They seem to control a lot, especially contraband. And extortion seems rife within the system, driven by these groups.
And there's a suggestion, a pretty strong one in some sources, about corruption playing a role, maybe making things worse.
That's a really troubling aspect, yes. The idea that some staff, some wardens might be complicit.
Complicit in what way? Turning a blind eye? Or?
It seems to range. The 2024 Ground-Up expose, the one about Mangong Prison, is a pretty chilling example. It alleged officials were basically ignoring serious gang violence.
Wow.
Which points to, potentially deep systemic issues, a breakdown in accountability maybe, something that needs a hard look.
Okay, so beyond the violence, which is obviously horrific, what about just the daily grind, the everyday reality for an inmate?
Well, the sources paint a pretty grim picture there, too. It's a struggle for just basic survival, it seems.
Like the cells themselves?
Exactly. Cells designed for, say, 20 people often end up holding 50, sometimes more.
50. In a space for 20.
Yeah. So you can imagine the conditions. Leaking pipes, mold mentioned, shared toilets for dozens of people. It inevitably leads to disease spreading.
Just basic supplies, things we take for granted.
Often critically scarce, according to the accounts. Soap, blankets, things like that are hard to come by.
And healthcare, if conditions are that bad.
It's described as woefully inadequate. There was a study in 2023. It found something like 40% of inmates had chronic health conditions that were just going untreated.
40%? That's shocking.
It really is. It paints a picture of immense suffering, frankly.
And what about rehabilitation? Isn't that supposed to be part of the picture?
Well, that's another deeply concerning finding. The sources suggest it's almost non-existent in practice.
Really?
Government data apparently shows only about 5% of inmates get access to any kind of vocational training.
Only 5%? That's tiny.
It is. And it makes you question, what the actual goal of the system is. Is it just warehousing people?
Or punishment over reform?
Exactly. It seems heavily skewed towards just confinement. If there aren't programs to help people gain skills, prepare for life outside. Well, what's the long-term plan? It seems to feed the cycle of crime.
There's a really powerful account, isn't there, from a former Pollsmoor inmate.
Yes, in the Mail and Guardian from 2024 described it as a constant cycle of violence.
And pressure to join gangs.
Huge pressure, just to survive, basically, for protection.
Right.
It really highlights how the environment itself can push people deeper into criminality, not away from it.
And for those who aren't in gangs, or are more vulnerable.
The sources suggest they face immense risks. Sexual assault, extortion. Tragically common, it seems. There's a profound lack of safety.
The psychological impact must be enormous.
Unimaginable, really. Some estimates mentioned suggest around 60% of inmates might suffer from depression or PTSD.
60%.
Yeah. And yet mental health services are described as virtually non-existent.
So you have trauma, harsh conditions, violence, and no support.
It's a recipe for despair, instability. Makes reintegration later even harder, you'd think.
But people find ways to cope.
It seems so. What's quite striking is the resilience mentioned, people forming informal support networks, sharing the little they have.
That basic human need for connection.
Even in the toughest environments, yeah.
Now, it's not just the inmates facing challenges, right? The sources also talk about the prison officers.
Absolutely. Their situation is also incredibly difficult, according to the material. Understaffing is a huge one, and undertraining.
What kind of staffing levels are we talking about?
In some places, the ratio is reported as high as 1 officer to 100 inmates.
1 to 100. How can you possibly maintain order or safety?
It's almost impossible. Creates a massively dangerous situation for everyone, the officers included.
And they face dangers directly.
Oh, yes. There were around 300 reported assaults on staff in 2023 alone.
300. That shows how volatile it is.
Definitely. And then you add in factors like low pay, burnout, morale must be incredibly low. Plus the corruption scandals we mentioned earlier, that must be demoralizing too.
But they're critical, right, for any kind of stability or potential change.
Absolutely crucial. They're on the front line. But their own challenges, the understaffing, the conditions, the risks, they become a massive barrier to any real systemic improvement.
So all these factors, the overcrowding, violence, lack of rehab, the pressure on staff, it leads us to think about the human cost and this cycle of reoffending, recidivism.
Exactly. Think back to that Polesmore inmates account. Coerced into a gang to survive. No counseling, no real rehab offered.
You mentioned the recidivism rate, 70%. What does that actually mean for listeners?
It means starkly that 7 out of 10 people released from prison in South Africa end up reoffending and likely returning to prison.
7 out of 10.
It powerfully illustrates how the current system, in many ways, seems to actually entrench criminal behavior, not fix it.
How so?
Well, if you're forced into crime or gang life inside prison just to stay safe, and then you're released with no new skills, no support network, maybe just the same desperate circumstances you left, the odds are stacked against you. Reoffending becomes almost predictable for many.
The 2024 statistic, the 70%, it's just undeniable evidence that the current approach isn't working.
It screams for a different approach, doesn't it? One that prioritizes genuine rehabilitation over just punishment.
Breaking that cycle has to be the goal.
It has to be. Focusing on actually preparing people to rejoin society productively, that benefits everyone in the long run.
So, okay, if the current system has these deep flaws, what does the path to reform look like? What are the sources suggesting?
Well, the core problems are clear, right? Overcrowding, violence fueled by gangs and corruption, and an environment that works against rehabilitation.
So the solutions need to tackle those things.
Exactly. The sources point to a few key areas. One is definitely reducing the sheer number of people locked up. Things like alternative sentencing, especially for nonviolent offenses, finding ways other than prison.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
What else?
Then there's the urgent need for more funding, specifically for better healthcare inside, and for real education and job training programs, things that offer a genuine path forward.
And tackling the corruption.
Absolutely critical. The need for a robust, independent oversight comes up. Ways to actually root out the corruption that seems to enable so much dysfunction.
Is there anything about learning from other places, other countries?
Yes. The material does mention looking at international models. Norway comes up specifically.
What's their approach?
Their focus is much more heavily on rehabilitation and reintegration, preparing inmates for release from day one, essentially. It's a different philosophy.
Interesting. So exploring different ways of doing things.
Precisely. And ultimately, the sources seem to suggest that public awareness is key.
Us talking about it now.
Exactly. A wider, deeper understanding of these realities. That's what can build the pressure, the demand for policies that are actually effective and humane.
So wrapping this up then, it feels like South Africa's prisons aren't just this separate hidden issue. They really mirror bigger societal problems, don't they?
They absolutely do. Systemic flaws, challenges in delivering justice, questions about what we want punishment versus rehabilitation to achieve. It's all reflected there.
But by facing these truths, even though they're uncomfortable, That's the starting point.
It has to be, to have informed, productive conversations about what real reform looks like, what a system that actually works could be.
And the end goal, based on everything we've looked at, seems to be transforming these places from institutions of despair, frankly, and cycles of crime.
And to places that offer a genuine chance for renewal, real second chances. That has to be the hope.
Which leaves us, and you listening, with a pretty big question to think about.
What role does society, all of us, really play in making sure rehabilitation can actually happen? And based on what we've dug into today, what do you think are the most vital first steps? Where do we even begin with reforming South Africa's prisons?
Lots to think about. We really encourage you to keep exploring these issues.